The Tories' plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda has rightly caused outrage, but for a few commentators, the full reality of the policy took a while to sink in. 3 days after it was announced, Piers Morgan tweeted, "Just discovered our new humanitarian refugee plan is to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, and if their application is successful, leave them there. I wonder how many people realise that sting in the tail. I also wonder how this qualifies as humanitarian." Now, it might have taken him 3 days, but Piers Morgan is right. If Patel's plans go ahead, even if a migrant is found to qualify as an asylum seeker once they arrive in Rwanda, they won't get to come back to the UK. They're stuck there. Those are the facts. But we might ask, why did it take Piers Morgan so long to get there? Well, in his defence, much of the media have reported the Tories' plans in misleading terms. It's described as a plan to process asylum seekers abroad, as opposed to a plan to deport them and ensure they never come back. But the Tories, for their part, didn't hide the harsh reality of their policy. This was Priti Patel and Boris Johnson announcing it.
This will see some of those arriving illegally in the UK, such as those crossing into the Channel in dangerous small boats, relocated to Rwanda to resettle and to rebuild their lives in the way in which the Minister has just outlined.
Because it means that economic migrants taking advantage of the asylum system will not get to stay in the UK, while those in genuine need will be properly protected, including with access to legal services on arrival in Rwanda, and given the opportunity to build a new life in that dynamic country, supported by the funding we are providing.
So Boris Johnson and Priti Patel explicitly said that asylum seekers, whether they like it or not, will be permanently resettled in Rwanda. Yet Piers Morgan, initially at least, just couldn't believe that could be true. Even when the Tories said exactly who they were, Morgan gave them the benefit of the doubt. And what stands out to me here is the contrast with how Jeremy Corbyn's announcements were received. He would say he wants to help fund independent media and regulate corporate control of the press. The pundit class would receive that as Corbyn wants a Stalinist crackdown on free speech. Yet now when Boris Johnson and Priti Patel stand up and explicitly say they'll deport asylum seekers without looking at their claims and that they'll never be able to come back, the pundit class assume that surely the Tories must mean they'll only send them there for processing. Another example of this phenomenon was Ian Dale. Following the announcements you just saw from Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, he had this conversation with an expert.
Larry Botanick is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, acting representative to the UK. Larry, very good evening. What's your reaction to this announcement today?
Thanks for having me. The only slight change I would make to your introduction was recognized refugees. I think once they're in Rwanda, they won't be brought back to the UK. That's at least how we read the plan. Our reaction.
Well, surely if they're given asylum, they would be. Otherwise, what's the point?
The point is, as you put it earlier, to deter people from coming over. They would be refugees in Rwanda and be expected to rebuild their lives there. Unless someone had a family member that appears here, there's nothing in the MOU, in our quick reading of it, that indicates recognized refugees will be brought back. It's not to integrate into the UK, it's to be processed and remain in Rwanda, as far as we can tell.
Well, that would certainly neither Boris Johnson nor Priti Patel made that clear today. I would have automatically assumed if they were asking for asylum to the UK and then they were taken to Rwanda, if they got asylum, they would then be brought back to the UK. Otherwise, they'd be applying for asylum in Rwanda.
Well, the intent is not to give people a choice where they apply. It's to make them stay in France or somewhere else in the EU. It's to keep them from getting on the boat. I'm not being in the position.
I get that, but it makes absolutely no sense to not bring them back. If they are applying for asylum in the UK and they are granted asylum, then come back to the UK. They surely must.
No, but if you were trying to deter them from coming, and as you put it, 70 or 80% have a good claim, then there wouldn't be any point in bringing them back. It wouldn't be a deterrence. It would just be a delay. I'm pretty confident.
I hesitate to disagree with you, but I can't believe that there is any logic in that at all, because otherwise they would then have to apply for asylum to the Rwandan government, not the British government.
Well, that's what they end up doing. They apply to Rwanda and they're decided by Rwanda.
But well, okay. Well, let's leave that one hanging for a moment.
Now, to be fair to LBC, they didn't hide the fact their host hadn't been properly briefed. They put this social media clip out showing the exact moment the penny dropped for Ian Dale.
I'm getting several people on text corroborating exactly what you just said about. I mean, I have to say, I'm really, really shocked by this. I mean, I thought it was a mad policy to begin with, but this makes it even madder. Anne in Rochester says, "Hi, Ian. The BBC are reporting that refugees sent to Rwanda have to stay in Rwanda. No return to the UK. Unbelievable, isn't it?" Well, how anybody can think that that is justifiable, I do not understand.
Ian Dale is a former Conservative candidate. He tried to be a Tory MP. So his shock shows Priti Patel's plans could face a fairly broad backlash. We'll talk about that in one moment. First, though, back to the confusion about the policy. This was Home Office Minister Tom Pursglove failing to demonstrate any understanding whatsoever of the country to which his government are planning to send refugees.
What about stuff like population, life expectancy, that kind of thing?
Well, it's clearly a country that is making enormous...
No, I mean, in terms of how many people live there and what's their life expectancy?
The fact is that clearly in Africa, there are many countries in Africa, and this is one that is at the forefront.
Sorry, the question was, do you know the population of Rwanda? And do you know how long people live there, the life expectancy?
I'm afraid I've not got that figure to hand this morning.
But we're sending people there.
We are.
Clearly in Africa, there are many countries in Africa, and this one is at the forefront. What does that mean? This is somewhere where you are sending people who are trying to get to Britain. You're sending them halfway across the world to a country you know absolutely nothing about. And yes, even if those particular statistics he didn't know, maybe he could have, brought out something else of interest that he knew about Rwanda, that he'd been briefed before he went and did the media round. This wasn't just a random guy off the street. Now, in case you are interested, I'm interested in these things. The population of Rwanda is around 13 million. Life expectancy is 69 years. That's 12 years below the UK, where life expectancy is 81, though it is above the average for sub-Saharan Africa, where it's 62. Another fact about Rwanda that might seem relevant, their population density is 525 people per square kilometre. In the UK, it's only 281 people per square kilometre. So contrary to claims from your average racist, it turns out Britain is very far from full. We're sending people halfway across the world to a country which, neither of these countries are full, but to a country which has more of a claim to be full than we do. So on those facts and figures, Google could have helped Pursglove. It wouldn't have done so when it comes to this next interview. This is Pursglove speaking to Sky.
What is the evidence base for the assertion from the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary that the overwhelming majority, according to Priti Patel, of people arriving in small boats are economic migrants?
So what is very clear is that around 70% of the individuals who are arriving are single adult males. But my point is this, that nobody should be coming to our country via small boat, whether that be males, whether that be women, whether that be children. Everybody is leaving what are fundamentally safe countries. There are perfectly functioning asylum systems in France and in other EU countries, and people should be using them when they're in those countries, rather than making these perilously unsafe journeys. So we have to take steps to address this. That's precisely what we are doing. And I think that this is an important intervention that dramatically shifts the dynamic, whilst also providing opportunities and sanctuary in Rwanda for individuals who wish to have that.
Sure, and I'm sorry to labour the point, Minister, but again, the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have both claimed that part of the rationale for this is that the majority of people arriving in small boats are economic migrants. I'm just again asking where the data is on that. We've asked the Home Office for it plenty of times. It's never been produced. Indeed, the Refugee Council suggests actually a significant majority of people who arrive in small boats are actually successful in their asylum claims, that they're not economic migrants at all.
The key principle here is that nobody should be getting in a small boat to come to the United Kingdom. We, quite rightly, have a rich and proud history in this country of providing sanctuary for thousands of people over the years, and you look at recent events with Ukraine and with Afghanistan, where we've established bespoke schemes, and we'll continue to do that. But what we can't have and what we can't accept is people putting their lives in the hands of these evil criminal gangs. That's why we think it's important to take these steps, and that's why we're pursuing this with Digger. We think this is an important intervention that we're making as part of the much wider package of reforms that we're introducing.
Yeah, I will note that, again, I have asked that question and the evidence base has not been brought forward. So perhaps the government can stop maintaining that the majority of people coming across the channel are economic migrants without giving us the detail in all of this.
Refugee Council analysis of the Home Office's own data suggests a full 61% of migrants who travel to Britain by boat successfully claim asylum, meaning they are, according even to the Home Office, genuine refugees. And no, the Tories can't suddenly rewrite humanitarian international law so that single men cannot be refugees. That they can. There is no lawyer who will say that is a legitimate argument to make. And that then was a Tory arguing with facts. The Easter weekend also saw ministers getting into rows with God. It all started when the Archbishop of Canterbury used his Easter address to say this.
And this season is also why there are such serious ethical questions about sending asylum seekers overseas. The details are for politics and politicians. The principle must stand the judgment of God, and it cannot. It cannot carry the weight of resurrection justice. It cannot carry the weight of life conquering death. It cannot carry the weight of the resurrection that was revealed first to the least valued. For as a policy, it privileges the rich and the strong. And it cannot carry the weight of our national responsibility as a country formed by Christian values, because subcontracting out our responsibilities, even to a country that seeks to do well, like Rwanda, is the opposite of the nature of God, who himself took responsibility for our failures.
Tory MP for Ipswich, Tom Hunt, hit back saying the leaders of the Church of England should be wary about clumsily intervening into complex political issues at the best of times. To do so on Easter Sunday feels very wrong. Archbishop of York views particularly wrong-headed, claims he's in tune with the majority of the public. So we showed you the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of York made a similar claim. I love this idea that Christians, you definitely shouldn't speak at special Christian events. I mean, that's obviously the time when they are most likely to make these kind of statements. Priti Patel has also written an article which has been seen as a rebuke to the Archbishop. It was written with her Rwandan counterpart and declared, "We are taking bold and innovative steps, and it's surprising that those institutions that criticize the plans fail to offer their own solutions. Successfully implementing this ambitious partnership will require concerted effort." This seems very disingenuous to me. On the one hand, we don't expect the Church of England to write policy documents, but they do, make moral judgments about things. That's perfectly normal. Also, there is a very obvious alternative solution, which experts have been talking about for years now. It's processing asylum claims in France. If you don't want people to cross the channel to claim asylum in Britain, then let them claim asylum in France. Barnaby, the Rwanda asylum plan was, obviously an attempt to get the government some friendly headlines before the local elections. They want to talk about migration instead of cost of living, instead of Partygate. Do you think that this, reasonably broad backlash suggests that maybe it's backfired?
I don't know if it'll work. It will get the right headlines in the tabloid press, and that may be all they care about. It is a policy sustained by utter contempt for truth. Take the two talking points the government uses. They use these talking points openly relaxed about the contempt for truth involved. They talk about safe and legal routes. They say these are refugees coming in unsafe routes. Safe and legal routes don't exist. Britain suspended, for most people, Britain suspended its refugee resettlement program at the start of COVID, hasn't properly restored it. Priti Patel had to row back a claim she made in Parliament that her Nationality and Borders Bill would include safe and legal routes, because it doesn't. So they say they castigate people for putting their lives at risk on dinghies. They say people didn't put their lives at risk on dinghies so much a few years ago. That's because people bundled themselves into trucks, which now that's been stopped mostly. So they attack people for putting their lives at risk on dinghies. They attack the people who drown as if they've chosen to risk drowning for themselves and their families, and speak to the public as if safe and legal routes to get to Britain are available, when for most people, they're not. There are simple solutions, like allowing people to claim asylum in embassies all over the world. There are simple solutions, like ensuring the asylum system doesn't take years and years while people wait for their claims to be processed. There are simple solutions, like allowing people to work while they are waiting for asylum claims. And none of these things the government pursues. Instead, it pursues this kind of violence. The second talking point is to say that the real problem here, the real violent people, are traffickers. This is this kind of awful mechanism by which people committing acts of violence try to wash their hands of responsibility. They say, we've shut down all safe and legal routes for most people most of the time. And then when some people in the cracks try to make some money risking people's lives on unsafe boats, we'll say they're the root of the problem. No, you, the state, are the root of the problem. Traffickers wouldn't have a business model if it weren't for the way you behaved. Now, when Israel did this a few years ago, sending people to Uganda and Rwanda, settler colonies are often laboratories for Western violence. Refugees just left when they got to Uganda and Rwanda. The policy was a total flop. So now there have been suggestions, people were sent back there and they just came back north to Europe. So now there have been suggestions that Britain will help Rwanda to build prisons to incarcerate the refugees who are sent there while they wait for a judgment. Could be years, because asylum claims take a long time to process in Britain. I don't think they'll be much quicker in Rwanda. What about those prisons that Britain may be helping Rwanda to build? Well, when refugees in migrant prisons protested in Rwanda in 2018 against cuts to their food rations, the Rwandan state opened fire, fired live ammunition against refugee protesters, killing at least 12 of them. And the Rwandan state then charged 60 protesters with rebellion just for asking for enough food to eat. Paul Kagame's regime in Rwanda stands accused of extrajudicial killings, of torture, the assassination of political opponents. Those opponents of his regime have been kidnapped and strangled in hotel rooms, even when they escaped the country, targeted as far afield as Dubai and South Africa. And the British government has warned Kagame critics in Britain that their lives may be at risk. This is the state with which Britain now wants to do a deal. This is the contempt they now show for refugees. It gets even more absurd. Britain gave 4 people, at least last year, 4 people asylum from Rwanda. So I want to know, will refugees from Rwanda be handed back by the British state to Rwanda? And if they get asylum, if the British state says, yes, you've been targeted horrendously by this regime in Rwanda, you can have asylum, will that asylum mean that they'll be able to live in Rwanda? Because that's what it will mean for most people. What about Ukrainians? We're told this won't apply to them. The British state says it's so concerned about what's happening in Ukraine. They're refugees that the state likes, so they won't be treated appallingly. Only refugees the state doesn't like will be treated appallingly. So just think of that. The difference between an economic migrant and a refugee, the legal difference, isn't an act of God. It's a difference in law. It's a difference in judgment. You become an economic migrant the moment a state doesn't recognize you as a refugee. So when the state says all these people are just economic migrants, bear in mind that in 2015, massive flows of migration, most people, everyone coming from Syria was recognized as a refugee, and most people, everyone coming from Afghanistan, from Iraq, for example. Now they've narrowed the net gradually more and more and more. They've used that category, economic migrant, expanded it, and said that most people fleeing horrors are actually just economic migrants, and they are piggybacking off the genuine refugees and they're to blame. The states that suffocate people, allow people to die, blame everyone else. Meanwhile, while the government is pursuing this plan to send people to a country that violates human rights systematically, according to the British government itself, all that the Labour Party, the official opposition, can say is that the plan may be too expensive. They don't even have it in them to begin their opposition by saying this is morally despicable. They're so concerned to appease what they think of in their patronising way as a deeply racist country. The official opposition won't say anything more than the fact that horrors cost too much money, and if only they were cheaper, then maybe it would be okay to imprison people in a country whose soldiers and police shoot refugees when they protest for extra food. That's what's come of the British state and of the official opposition in Britain.